Yeah, I'm presenting, as you said, AnICA. Yeah, the work on characterizing these inconsistencies in these microarchitectural code analyzers. When I say microarchitectural code analyzers, I mean performance prediction tools that work on a basic block level, which means these tools, given a basic block, which is a sequence of a branch-free sequence of machine instructions, these tools will predict the number of processor cycles a given processor microarchitecture will need to execute it in a steady state on average. So basically execute it in a long-running loop. For example, a basic block like this, which in x86 implements a vector multiplication. Don't worry too much about the semantics here. You don't really need to understand assembly here to get the point of the talk. This basic block might be predicted to take 4 cycles on average based on dependencies among the instructions, available instruction level parallelism, and also things like latencies and the like. These tools are useful for a variety of things. So for example, for manual code optimization to find performance bottlenecks, but also for automatic things like guiding program optimizations and also for estimating the cost of some codes that you want to try in program synthesis. In the recent years, quite a number of tools that follow this pattern. Some of them also provide more information, but they all share the goal of predicting this basic block throughput. Quite a lot of these tools have been presented. They use a variety of techniques to pursue this goal. So for example, llvm-mca is part of the LLVM compiler infrastructure and uses their scheduling models to predict basic block throughput. Other tools like uiCA and uiCA use, on the one hand, information gleaned from the manuals of the hardware manufacturers, but also results from a lot of custom micro benchmarks to get accurate models of the hardware. And again, another line of research, including tools like Ithemal, difftune, and Granite, which is so recent that we couldn't even cover it in our evaluation because it was released after that. They use machine learning. So basically, they train on a set of basic blocks and measurements and predict throughput based on that. So with such a variety of tools available, at least I could not help but ask myself the question, those tools, if you configure them to use the same microarchitecture, they should produce the same results, right? Because they should have the same goal. However, if we really try to validate this assumption, we'll get a somewhat different picture. So what we did was we randomly generated 10,000 basic blocks consisting of 4 x86 instructions each. And we gave them to a range of these throughput predictors. So, for example, here, llvm-mca, llvm-mca, uiCA, uiCA, Ithemal, and difftune. And for each pair of these predictors, we looked into what percentage of the sampled basic blocks were predicted inconsistently, which we just defined to be, that's the relative difference between the predictions was more than 50%. And we displayed these results in such a heat map here. So what it means is, for example, for when we compare uiCA with llvm-mca, we found that 31% of the sampled basic blocks were predicted inconsistently. So looking at these numbers, we can see that quite a significant number of basic blocks for every combination of tool is predicted inconsistently. For comparisons, including Ithemal and difftune, we find that around half of the basic blocks are substantially inconsistent. But also for the other tools, we still have a fifth to a third of the generated basic blocks all predicted inconsistently. So when seeing this, at least I found this pretty worrisome, and therefore that's basically the motivation for our work here. We wanted to come up with a way of systematically finding and characterizing these inconsistencies in a helpful way, such that users and also the tool developers benefit from the results, so that we can either understand what these tools do differently, if there's a reason to that, or if there's no reason to that, to at least help improve these tools. There might be reason to that because it's not necessarily related to bugs in the tools, but there might also just be different modeling assumptions or simplifications that tool developers might or might not tell you about in the documentation. So this goal, however, comes with quite the challenge, because these tools use really a large variety of techniques. So on the one hand, we really have a lot of different complex CPU models that are used, which are quite difficult to work through. Then we have the neural network-based tools, which I guess no one really understands what they're doing. And then again, on the other hand, it would be really cool to also compare these tools against measurements on the actual hardware, because we can also do that to some extent. And there, we have no chance at all to look into them and see what they're doing. So things that you might want to do with tools to understand what they're doing, like static analysis, just don't apply, because we need to treat them as black boxes. So what we do, therefore, is we apply, at least on a high level, the standard technique of differential testing. The idea is that we start by taking some random test input, in our case, a basic block. We give it to a pair of throughput predictors and see what the results are. If they disagree substantially, that's interesting. If either of the tools or both of them crash, that's even more interesting. We repeat this and as often as really necessary until we've found enough problems. And in the end, we report all the interesting basic blocks that we found. This straightforward approach, however, comes with a problem, because as we've already seen in the heat map, it's really easy to stumble over a lot of inconsistencies. So with the heat map, we basically already have shown that it's really easy to find thousands of inconsistent basic blocks, which is just too much for a developer or a tool user to tackle and try to figure out what the problem might be. Probably many of these basic blocks are inconsistent based on a similar issue, but it's difficult to tell from just looking at a large number of basic blocks. So that's where our main contribution comes in, because we extend this rather straightforward approach in a way that after finding a new interesting basic block, as described before, we additionally do some test case reduction to prune irrelevant instructions so that we at least can ignore them. And then also we apply a generalization technique, so that we, instead of just presenting individual basic blocks, we can present representations of larger sets of basic blocks that all lead to inconsistent behavior in the throughput predictors. These generalizations are also helpful because they allow us to ignore new interesting basic blocks that we found that are already covered by previous discoveries. Let's go through these steps with an example. First, for finding a new interesting basic block, we start by randomly sampling a list of instruction schemes. Instruction schemes are, well, machine instructions. However, instead of explicit operands like registers and the like, they have typed holes instead of these operands. So here, for example, again, don't worry too much about the semantics. Suffices to say that we have 4 x86 instruction schemes that we sampled here. The first 2 are vector instructions. The first one of those has a memory operand, can be seen from the XMM word pointer in the representation. The third instruction is a compare instruction, pretty simple. And the last one is an fx restore instruction operating on 64 bits, which just loads some data from memory into some floating point control register. Again, don't worry too much about the semantics of this basic block. The next step then is to randomly select legal operands for the typed holes so far. We then have actually a valid basic block that we can put into, so we could execute it or we could put it into the tools under investigation, which we do. And for this example here, we might find out that llvm-mca, the LLVM-based tool, crashes for this input. So that's definitely interesting. So the next step is to see what instructions we can remove from this interesting basic block and still have an interesting basic block in the end. We use a greedy and randomized algorithm for this purpose, which basically means that we remove instructions as long as it stays interesting. And if we remove an instruction that makes the basic block no longer interesting, we add it back in and continue. Here, for example, we might find out that the inner two instructions are actually not really necessary to have an interesting basic block, so we just remove them. Removing either of the outer two instructions leads to a basic block that no longer crashes llvm-mca and therefore is no longer interesting. So the resulting pruned abstract basic block is then the input to really the core of the AnICA approach that we present here. Here we generalize this basic block in a way that we get a representation of a set of basic blocks. We call it an abstract basic block, including, well, on the one hand, we want to still include the input basic block, obviously, but also similar basic blocks as long as they're interesting as well. So as long as they still cause inconsistencies or cause crashes or the like. We want these representations to be as large as possible so that the results that we find are as general as possible. If we really went for the the optimization way of trying to find an optimal such representation, we would find us with a computationally hard or even impossible problem because all these tools are black boxes in our view. So, however, we don't really need to have such an optimal and exact solution because our goal was just to produce insightful results that help users and developers. So what we do instead is we approximate these finding such an optimal representation with randomized algorithms. It works as follows. So again, we start with the pruned basic blocks, here represented as a single dot in the set of all basic blocks. Starting from this, we first generate an abstract basic block that is as narrow as possible, which in our case means that it represents all basic blocks that share the same instruction schemes, so same kind of instruction as the original one. Marked here, so the set of represented basic blocks with this small blue set around the original basic block. With this initial abstract block, we then apply an expansion, which means that we pick one constraint on the set of represented basic blocks that this abstract block has and relax it. So for example, we might relax the constraints that the fx restore instruction only we only look at the 64-bit version of the fx restore instruction, but look at every instance of any fx restore instruction. We obtain a new, slightly more general abstract block that represents a slightly larger set of concrete basic blocks. We would like to find out whether this new abstract basic block is interesting, so if all the represented basic blocks are interesting. But again, finding that out is computationally hard. Instead, we just randomly sample a number of basic blocks from the set of represented basic blocks. And those individual basic blocks we can then give to the throughput predictors and find out whether they're interesting. In this case, for example, we will find out that all of our samples will be still interesting. So we accept this expansion and use it as our new hypothesis. Next step then again is starting over again, doing another expansion. For example, here we might relax the constraint of using memory in the first instruction, leading to a slightly larger set of represented basic blocks. If we then here randomly sample concrete basic blocks from there and check whether they're interesting, we will find that some of them are interesting, but there will also quite likely be some that are no longer interesting. In this case, we reject this expansion because it generalized the basic block in a direction too far and not try this way of expanding the basic block again, but instead go again with the previous abstract block and try a different expansion from there. If we, for example, remove the requirements of 128-bit width with this vector instructions, we get a still interesting abstract basic block, which you can then continue to generalize over and over again until at some point we come to the point where no more ways to expand the abstract block remains that we haven't explored before. In our case, the resulting abstract block would then be, for example, one that represents all basic blocks, where the first instruction is an arithmetic vector instruction with a memory operand, and the second one is an fx restore instruction. Looking at, well, the picture there, you might already have guessed the inspiration for this approach, because the setting looks quite a bit like abstract interpretation. And yeah, so what we have is we have two domains, a concrete domain and an abstract domain. Contrary to the usual case, the concrete domain contains sets of basic blocks instead of sets of program behaviors. But we have, for example, the connection from abstract blocks to represented basic blocks. That's just the concretization function gamma that we all know and love. And also the step from an concrete basic block to an abstract one obviously corresponds to the abstraction function alpha. Applying an expansion is just a way to get to a successor in the domain partial order in the abstract domain, really. What do we get from this? Because obviously it's not about soundness, because we approximate everything with randomized algorithms anyway. However, this allows us to use certain things that we've seen in abstract interpretations, abstract domain design already. We can design our basic block abstraction that we need to have, just like we would design a modular abstract domain for a program analysis. So in our case, the basic block abstraction is basically a reduced product of two components. On the one hand side, we have a list of instruction abstractions, which represent constraints on the represented instruction schemes. Each instruction abstraction has a list of different features, like the mnemonic of the instruction or how memory is used by the instruction. And each of them has a a similators in this case, that here, for example, might represent if and how the instruction uses memory. On the other side, we have the aliasing abstraction, which is basically a relational abstract domain that encodes constraints on pairs of instruction operands. So there you can express things like first operand of the first instruction must or must not alias with the first operand of the second instruction. Aliasing here not necessarily via memory, but also just for registers with the same name. Another benefit that we take from this abstract interpretation connection is that we have quite a clear idea of what it means for a concrete basic block to be covered by an abstract basic block, which was the fourth step of the high-level algorithm that I've shown. And the idea is that you just need to check whether this basic block is in the concretization of the abstract block, which is at least nice to think about, I think. So we implemented this approach and performed some evaluation. We went into two directions. On the one hand, we wanted to have quantitative results about how effective the generalization, which really is the key of the thing, is. For this purpose, we revisited the heat map from the beginning and wanted to see how many of the inconsistent basic blocks there could we find through our testing approach. On the other side, we also wanted not only to rely on numbers, but also look into the results and see whether there are insights that can be gleaned from them, for which we have several case studies, some of which I'm going to present in the end of this talk. But first, for the first direction, let's revisit again the heat map here in red on the right-hand side. Again, it shows the percentage for each predictor pair of basic blocks that were predicted inconsistently. What we did was for each of these predictor pairs, we ran an AnICA campaign, finding 150 abstract basic blocks. which represent inconsistencies. And then we looked for each predictor pair how many of the interesting basic blocks from the heat map are represented by these discoveries. And we've shown that, or we show that in the green heat map here on the right. So for example, of the 31% of interesting basic blocks within the uiCA versus llvm-mca campaign, we found that 83% of them were represented by our AnICA discoveries. Overall, we can see that in almost all of the cases, more than 50% of the interesting basic blocks were covered, which is quite a high number, I find, going up even to almost 100% for the Osaka and Yaka campaign. We can see that, for these, the campaigns not including Ithemal and Difftune, we have really even a higher number than for the other ones, really only starting from around 70% and going up. The next step that we did was from these 150 AnICA discoveries on each campaign, we extracted the 10 discoveries that were covering the most of the interesting basic blocks and reproduced this heat map with these discoveries only. So here, only 10 of our abstract basic blocks were considered for covering the interesting basic blocks. And we can find that even then, for quite a large number of the campaigns, more than 50% and up to 82% of the interesting basic blocks were still covered. So here, really, 10 of the AnICA discoveries were able to represent thousands of inconsistent basic blocks from our first thing, which we consider quite a lot more helpful for actual debugging. You can also see that for Ithemal and Difftune, these numbers are, or campaigns including Ithemal and Difftune, these numbers are quite a bit lower. So for a first case study, let's look into reasons for that. If we look into the Ithemal versus uiCA campaign, which was particularly bad on the previous slide, we can actually find quite a lot of abstract basic blocks that look like this one. They consist only of a single instruction abstraction, which is as narrow as possible, only allowing a single instruction scheme. In this case, the x86 rotate left instruction by a value in the C register. And we find that our generalization algorithm finds in some early check that this abstract block is considered not consistently interesting. So not all of the samples, even for this simple basic block, are consistently interesting. We provide a user interface which allows us to actually look into the basic blocks that we give to the tools, and there we can find reasons for that. Because if we look into what Ithemal here predicts for slightly different instructions, which is just you change simply the register that is the operand of the rotate instruction, you can see that suddenly 3 times the throughput is achieved according to Ithemal, which we most certainly found surprising, because you would expect this to not change anything at all, which also the other tools and the benchmarking say. So I would argue that AnICA here discovered quite the unexpected behavior in Ithemal, which is insightful, even though the generalization results were not that strong. For our next case study, that's actually the origin of our running example, because there we found this FX restore crash in llvm-mca, which was a problem up to LLVM version 12. For LLVM version 13, we actually noticed that independently of our work, someone apparently also noticed this problem and reported it, and it has been fixed. However, their bug report consisted of more than 300 instructions. And if you imagine a test input consisting of 300 x86 instructions, you don't want to see that. So here, our work really just automatically found this simple 2-instruction description for this pretty long-standing bug that did affect actual users. And we even have more high-level insights, because we can see that it's necessary to have a memory operand in the first thing. So we can already see that it's probably something related to the memory subsystem. That's how it's modeled in llvm-mca. The last case study, there we did something slightly different. Here we compared llvm-mca's AMD model, or model for the AMD Zen Plus architecture, with actual measurements on the machine. We found numerous inaccuracies in this model, some of which were previously known and reported, others not so. So in particular, we filed issues for 5 of AnICA's discoveries, affecting 72 instruction schemes, which were then confirmed and fixed by the developers. So here, really, the results of AnICA helped to improve LLVM's performance model for these architectures. And not only llvm-mca, because these models are also used in the compiler pipeline for instruction scheduling and the like, and selection. So to summarize what we've seen, these basic block throughput predictors they are numerous, but they quite often don't really agree on the basic blocks that they get in their predictions. We therefore used techniques from differential testing and also a technique inspired by abstract interpretation to come up with a method of characterizing these things automatically. Our evaluation shows that generalization is actually quite effective, at least in finding these inconsistencies, and also that we can really get some interesting insights from the results. That's all I have to say, so thank you for listening.
Okay, so for questions, maybe...
Should I give the mic? Okay.
Right.
Hi. So you said there are different techniques that each of these tools use to make their prediction. Did you see some kind of connection between the specific technique a tool used and how effective your system was at covering the different interesting basic blocks?
I mean, the clearest thing is with the machine learning based approaches and the other ones. So we inherently have the granularity of instruction schemes. So it's quite natural that tools that also think in instruction schemes, which is the case for example, uiCA and also to some extent OOPSLA and llvm-mca, that those would be a better fit because they have less chance of doing what we've seen Ithemal do. Whereas for the other tools that really, Ithemal that just looks at the representation of the instructions, there is even the potential just for getting inconsistencies on this level. So there we cannot generalize as well, but we can still find interesting things.
Any other questions? Oh, there you are.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I was wondering, so you started with taking random test input.
Yes.
I was wondering whether the results would have looked different if you would have taken 4 instruction basic blocks from real programs, like, for instance, the classic sets of benchmarks, like the spec benchmarks people typically use to train these kind of things.
Well, it still would have been about starting from them, and so that's definitely something that you can do. You start from not random basic blocks, but from other ones. But you still, at least in our setting, for generalizing, you still need to randomly select. So I'm not sure whether you would really find that much of a difference in the generalization behavior, at least.
So I was mostly interested in kind of the difference between the tools. So your very first heat map, right? So would you expect the results to be kind of closer, since that's likely what they trained on? than with the random blocks, or would you still expect significant differences?
To some extent, I would still expect some significant differences because, so one major issue that I've found with these that I didn't mention in the talk but is mentioned in the paper is that, for example, these tools model dependencies in memory differently quite a bit, some explicitly, some implicitly. So for example, if you have basic blocks that read and write memory at the same position, which is quite often in x86 if you have an instruction that, well, modifies memory, then some of these tools will just assume that all of the memory operations do not alias. Some will assume that they do alias, and some, so yeah, Ithemal learned something slightly weird there again, because they're, the instruction is dependent on itself, but not on other instructions, is what I've observed there. So yeah, you would still find these kind of differences there. Maybe not as pronounced as here with the randomly sampled ones, but still.
All right, thank you.
All right.